Welcome back to the Seedy AF podcast. I'm Jocelyn.
And I'm the Omega. Today we will be answering all of your questions about writing. What tools do we use? What's our process from planning the story to writing the dialogue? How do we keep track of all the branching out choices? And what makes writing so hard? Now let's get seedy.
We've received a lot of questions about writing since we started this podcast, so we're going to try to answer all of them in this episode. The first question came from Scruffington on our Discord. They asked, what are some good tools that you use for your writing? I'm still working on short stories and feel a bit flat always using Word. So when I started writing and I wanted to make writing a professional job in like 2012, 2013, I started using Word and Excel because those were the programs that I was comfortable with. And so I've pretty much stuck with basically the equivalent of that now, which is Google Docs and Google Sheets. The only real problem with Word was that back then, if you didn't save, you could easily lose stuff if something happened to your computer, and it wasn't very easy to sync versions across multiple devices, and there was no way to recover past versions of things. So that's something that I really like about Google Docs and Google Sheets. And to be clear, I use Google Docs for the writing, and I often use Google Sheets for planning things out where I need to see things in a little bit more high-level way. But yeah, that's kind of the boring answer, which is that I also just use a basic word processor. And yeah, like I said, I like Google Docs because it saves automatically. I can go back to previous versions. If there's something that I deleted that I want to recover, I can go back and grab it. I can access the same version from multiple devices, and that's important for us because we have our PCs, but we also have MacBooks, and we do a lot of work on the go. So being able to always have the latest version available to me is really important. And I really like Google Docs because it has a lot of collaborative tools for things like commenting, editing, and suggesting and sharing. And then there's, again, a record of that you can retrieve of all previous versions of those things. So in general, I really like Google Docs. I have started using the app that we use for planning, which is ClickUp. It's kind of like Trello, or is that the one that I'm thinking of?
Yeah, Trello's right. That's the one we were using in Prince Suburbia.
Yeah.
Before we went to ClickUp.
It's like a Scrum. It's like a programming.
Yeah, like a
method.
Kanban board, or like a ticket board, where you put a bunch of tickets and then tasks that are on there, and you organize yourself that way.
Yeah. So we started with Trello, but then we moved to ClickUp because I wanted something that had like a little bit more functionality for, being able to sort the tasks and assign different variables and things. But the cool thing about ClickUp is that it has a lot of other tools. It has its own document system that's kind of like Google Docs. And I like ClickUp a little bit better in that I can create a document and then I can create subpages within the document. So it's kind of like having like a folder, and then I have like tabs on the side where I can go from page to page, which in Google Doc, you can kind of achieve the same thing by giving things headings, and then you get like a table of contents on the side where you can go from heading to heading. But with ClickUp, being able to make the subpages for me is a little bit easier to organize. So I now use ClickUp for outlining. So like when I'm going to outline all the content for the chapter, I make a tab for each scene, and that's where I put notes about the scene before I'm ready to write it. And so I can kind of just get like a high level view of everything. I wish that ClickUp had more features that Google Doc has, because I would probably use it for everything if it did, but it's still pretty new. So it's missing some of the features that Google Doc has, the most important of which is find and replace. It has find, but it doesn't have find and replace. And you'd be surprised how often you need find and replace. So that's the one feature that's kind of kept me from using it completely, but it's still just another word processor. It's not a specific application that's specific to writing. But to answer this question, over the years, I definitely have tried various applications. I just keep coming back to Google Docs or Word or whatever is kind of the basic word processor of the moment. Scrivener is an app that's been around for a long time. It's very well known in the novel writing world. And it kind of achieves what I was talking about with ClickUp, where you can write an outline and then it'll split up that outline into sections. And then you can go in and write a particular section. And it just has a lot of native features that really help you map out a long-term writing project, like a novel or a PhD thesis or something where you're writing like hundreds of thousands of words. It helps you kind of keep that organized. I'm a pretty organized person. So like I said, I've been able to always kind of set up the same type of thing just by putting headings in my documents so that I can navigate around using the headings. But Scrivener is an app that a lot of people swear by. What's kept me from using it or kept me from adopting it early on is that it's native, or it sits on one device. I think just now I looked it up today, and they now have a way that you can sync versions between devices using like Google Drive or one of those other like
cloud platforms.
Yeah, I can't remember. They had a specific one that they mentioned, Dropbox.
Oh yeah.
Or like the iTunes like iCloud, which for me is just like not enough. Like I need the instantaneous like update that I get with Google Docs, where I can literally walk from my computer and or walk away from my computer, pick up my laptop and just pick up right where I left off without having to do anything. So that's really important to me. And it seems like Scrivener has kind of been behind the times on that. So that's always kind of held me back from using it, because you also have to buy a license for every device that you're going to use it on, which, you know, is not a huge deal if you're only using 1 or 2 devices, but it just kept me from using it. People swear by it though. I've heard it's a great app, so I definitely don't want to say anything negative about it. It just wasn't for me. I know a lot of people use Twine, not just to plan like large interactive stories, but also to publish them. It's kind of like RenPy, but without the visuals. So I know that's one. And then there's a couple other tools that are more specific to like video game, dialogue, branching choices that I'll get into with another question. But really, you know, even if you feel like Word or something is too basic, like I really think most people just use a really basic application. Like you just don't need a lot of bells and whistles when it comes to writing. A lot of times I find they can even be a distraction. You can spend a lot of time using all the tools to plan things out and organize things instead of just sitting down and writing. And I know that's often true for me. If I try to use one of these applications, I spend a lot more time like messing around with the features than I do with the actual writing. And I know for a fact that a lot of developers in the adult game industry just write directly into Notepad or into their text or their code editor like Atom or VS Code or whatever they're using to work in RenPy. That to me seems a little bit risky, especially if you're not pushing up to GitHub on a regular basis, because you can lose previous versions of things. Also, while there is a spell check for VS Code, and I'm assuming for Atom, there's no grammar check, which Google Drive or Google Docs has and Word has and any other like major word processor is going to have. So that'll catch little things for you, like using the wrong your or their or things like that. So I think it's a little bit risky to type directly in a Notepad personally when you have tools like Google Docs, but a lot of devs swear by it.
Just to add on to that real quick, there are extensions in VS Code. The thing is, you can't guarantee like how good they are as far as like grammar checking, spell checking, etc. So it's just better in general to try to use an actual word editor, in my opinion. And then Google Docs is great, and then the sharing ability and all the features that you were mentioning, that those are huge reasons why you want to use that over direct implementation in like an IDE like that.
Yeah,
in my opinion at least.
Yeah, and I don't know why you would want to type directly into Notepad. I don't know if people feel like Google Docs is not clean. If you don't know, with Google Docs, you can hide the toolbar and you can also make it pageless so that it's just a constant scroll. There's no like page markings, which I know for me are distracting when I'm not going to be printing it out. But in my opinion, Google Docs, there's also a lot of third-party add-ons like with VS Code where they're of varying quality. But, in general, Google Docs has always had everything I need. So that's what I would recommend, or whatever is right for you. Whatever gets you writing is the best tool. A user whose username I don't know how to pronounce, but a user on our Discord asked, how do you approach the story writing? Do you add story while you go, or is it all written out and set in stone from the start? I think we've kind of touched on this when we've talked about what goes into writing an update. We definitely have a high-level plan from the start of kind of, in general, what's going to happen each update and how many updates they're going to be. And then when we start a new update, we drill down a little bit more, figure out exactly what scenes are going in, what's happening in those scenes, and then get down to writing them. So there's definitely a plan going into it. Of course, plans change. As we talked about with A Shot in the Dark, we had 12 updates planned, and we've combined them to be more like 8 or 9. And all the same content is still there. It's just combined into less updates. And so I did have to sit down one day and kind of like move everything around. Like, okay, I'm going to move this into this chapter and move that into that chapter to reduce the number of chapters that there were, even though all the same plot points are going to happen. So we definitely plan. And, in the novel writing world, they talk about there's people that are planners and then there's people that are pantsers. And the pantsers term comes from the English phrase, like flying by the seat of your pants, like you're just making it up as you go along. I know a lot of very famous writers are pantsers. Stephen King prides himself on never planning anything. In fact, he thinks, from what I've read in his book on writing, he thinks any type of planning or outline sucks the soul out of your writing, which I could not live like that. I think some people, there are definitely successful writers that don't plan anything, but I would argue that they seem to have a very good intuitive sense of what the structure of a story is and what should happen at what points. And so they just don't really need to plan explicitly, but I would argue that they still they're still following the plan that most writers would be following. They're just able to do it without sitting down and planning it first. I don't think that it's a negative to sit down and plan first. I think the whole planners versus pantsers kind of argument that happens in the writing world is kind of overblown because, again, I think that all pantsers are definitely thinking about their writing outside of writing, and that's a form of planning. And then I think also that anybody who plans that out ahead of time, I doubt there's a person on the planet that ever sat down and wrote exactly what they planned and never deviated and never had a new idea and never changed anything. So I think everybody falls somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. In general, I'm a big planner, so I definitely like to plan out. There's a plot structure and there's certain expectations that people have when it comes to storytelling, at least in the Western world, there's a standard. And so if you deviate from that too much, it just makes people, even if they can't put their finger on why, it'll make them feel like the story is too fast or too slow, or there's not enough happening, or there's too much happening, or things came out of nowhere, or, if you don't plan out the structure, then it'll leave a lot of people feeling like something is missing or something is off. So I definitely believe in planning. But yeah, of course, as you're writing, things are going to change. And certainly, the plans change all the time. So in that sense, it's not like set in stone, but certainly we have a plan from the start. And especially with something like an adult visual novel that's typically released in episodes, it's kind of like a TV show in that, they sit down at the beginning of the season and they plan out the general arcs for the season, even if they don't know, word for word what's going to happen in every episode, because, you have to sometimes plant seeds for things that are going to happen many episodes later. And so if you wait to just make it up as you go along, like that might work for Stephen King, where he's writing one novel and then releasing it all at once. But when you're releasing something that's episodic, you definitely have to know what's coming so that you can set the player up for it. We do plan, but things do change as we go along. I can't think of anything like major that's changed. It's mostly little things.
Would you say that like movies that go out there, that if they don't follow that typical structure like you're talking about, that they can end up feeling weird or unsatisfying?
For sure. And I think if anything, screenplays for movies and TV shows are even more formulaic than novels. I do think writers of novels play around more with the structure of what's expected. Whereas if you think about all the money that's going to go into making a movie or a TV show, they really can't afford to play around too much and potentially flop. And so they're going to stick with the formula that works. Now, a formula is a series of variables. The variables are still infinite possibilities. So even if the formula is this type of thing happens, this type of thing happens, this type of thing happens, there's still infinite possibilities within that. But certainly, yes, I think that a lot of times when people say this movie was too fast or too slow or whatever, it's often because they tried to mess around with the typical structure that people expect. And I will say too that what a Western audience expects from a story is very different than what an Eastern audience expects from a story. Storytelling is something that is natural to humans. We've used stories since before there was written language to relay history and information and things. So to an extent, storytelling is kind of hard coded into our brains in that we all enjoy and will retain information that we learn via a story. But storytelling structure is kind of more cultural. And so, we have things like the 3-act structure and the hero's journey. And I don't know as much about Eastern storytelling. You probably know more because you watch more anime. But I get the impression that theirs is a little bit more character driven than plot driven. Western storytelling is, there's definitely character development happening and characters are important, but the structure is based on the plot. And then the plot drives the character development. My understanding is that it's kind of the opposite with Eastern storytelling. It's more about the character developing and then the plot serves that.
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate, at least from what I've watched. Not just anime, but also movies and TV series. One example, I don't remember the name of it, but I watched a sumo wrestling, Japanese TV series. And yeah, it was very character driven. It was very focused on them and how they developed and their own arc, and basically the world revolved around them in the show. And eventually, they went from really crappy sumo to really amazing sumo and reached the peak of whatever potential that they had. And, as a viewer, that kind of thing, I feel like they can both be very satisfying, whether or not it's the story or the character, the plot driving, as long as it's done really well.
Yeah, I get the impression too that that's where you get more of obviously the Eastern storytelling is a big influence in adult visual novels because of its close relationship with anime and, hentai and Japanese visual novels and all these other things. And that's where you get the slice of life, right? Where it's more about examining a character. I've definitely heard the kind of I don't know if it's criticism, but stereotype that Eastern storytelling has no conflict. But again, I'm not an expert, so definitely anybody out there that knows more about this, I would be happily corrected if I'm wrong. But my understanding is it's not that like there's no conflict, because a story without conflict is boring, but it's more about that like in Western storytelling, the conflict like drives the plot and is specifically tied into whatever the character's goal is and is like standing in the way of them achieving their goals. Whereas like in Eastern storytelling, it's more about, the character's going to go from point A to point B, and they're going to encounter conflict along the way, but the conflict isn't always directly tied to the plot. It's not always like cohesive in that way. It's just kind of like they're just encountering problems like anybody else would encounter, but they're not necessarily all centered around one like specific theme or plot point. So
yeah, sometimes like in anime, for example, sometimes it can be like that. They certainly sprinkle like fan service episodes in where there's nothing going on other than just having a fun time, like slice of life thing you're talking about. Then you have the slice of life anime, which is just very minor stuff that's happening, minor conflict, not huge things. But there can also be some more dramatic type. I would say that like the really good anime that is out there, they very much have conflict and plot. So maybe there's like more of a balance between the character development and the plot development. Certainly conflict with antagonists and everything going on in there.
Yeah, I mean, it would make sense to me that like I've never been somebody that enjoys anime, even when I've given it a chance. Like I can enjoy an episode or two, but I never get invested enough to like want to follow a series. And I'm sure that's my cultural bias of like, yes, I'm definitely very not that I think it's better, but just that's what I'm most accustomed to is like Western storytelling. And it's definitely a formula that like works for me as somebody that's seeking entertainment. And I just don't really click with that, which doesn't mean that it's bad. It's just that I don't click with it. It's definitely made for a different audience.
That being said, you've also watched Death Note. What did you think of Death Note?
I watched like one episode.
Yeah.
I mean, I can appreciate the quality that goes into anime. And like I said, I can enjoy an individual episode like, oh, that was interesting. But so far, I've never found one that really like grips me in and makes me want to watch like episode after episode, which, is like, again, I think it often has to do with the fact that it is kind of meandering. And I'm like, where is this going? And I don't feel any of the touchstones that I'm looking for subconsciously in a story. Like, even in what the Western world, like even reality television, right? Like, they started calling it unscripted television instead of reality television. Like they certainly plan out like, okay, we're going to do this event. We're going to do that event. Like this is going to be the conflict that you're facing. And then we're going to resolve that conflict within the episode. And then, it's not scripted in that, like they're kind of improvising or just letting life happen within this like situation itself. But it's definitely all planned around like there's going to be a conflict and then it's going to get resolved or it's going to leave on a slight cliffhanger for the next episode. Like we're all kind of accustomed in the Western world to this kind of formula. And I'm sure for people that enjoy Eastern media, like I'm sure it has its own patterns. It's just that I'm not familiar with them. So they just don't resonate. Like I just feel like what in the world is going on here? It feels so random and chaotic to me in a way that I'm sure it doesn't for people that are more accustomed to it,
Yeah, there's definitely some anime that meander, like you say, before it actually starts to get going. And sometimes it takes multiple episodes for me to actually get into it. And that's a threshold where some people get turned off and some people make it. Sometimes I give it a second chance when there's no other like new good anime out there. One example for me is The Ranking of Kings. That weird anime that had the deaf kid that I showed you. The first couple episodes didn't grip me, but as the story developed, the feels really hit me. I was like, damn, this is actually really good.
Right. Because you were invested in the character.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, for whatever reason, I love character-driven stuff. I love character stuff. It's just for whatever reason, I just need that structure of the plot to be tied in with it. I reject the idea that, Western storytelling doesn't involve itself in characters. It's just that it's always hanging on like a plot structure, right? In Western storytelling, like I said, there's a 3-act structure. There's the first act, second act, third act. And the first act is like the first 25%. The second act is like from 25 to 75%. And then the third act is like 75% to the end. I honestly, for my own planning, I don't like that because the second act is like not the same length as the first and third. And so my brain doesn't work that way. I like to split things into like even chunks, especially for episodic things. Then I can split those down even further into episodes. So I do like 4. I break up the second act into before the midpoint and after the midpoint. But yeah, I mean, if you pay attention in any good storytelling for the Western world, like, there's going to be an inciting event, like something that, sets them on their journey or gives them their goal or whatever, changes their world in some way. That's going to happen by the 10 to 15% mark. If it doesn't happen by that point, you're like, where the hell is this story going? By the 25%, you're going to have your first plot point where they are like, now they are in it. There is no going back. They're going after this goal. There's like just no chance of them ever going back to their old life. Those are the types of like plot touchstones that you look for, even in a super character driven story that, is just missing for me from Eastern stories. And so it makes it harder for me to enjoy, but if I powered through more of it, I'm sure I would start picking up on the pattern and I would enjoy it more. So yeah, I plan everything out according to like the 3-act structure. Like I said, I split it up into 4. But yeah, I mean, it gets really granular with that structure. It's been, torn apart, and you can read a million books on what that structure looks like. And if you watch any successful movie or read most successful novels, they will follow that structure down to like the individual percentage point, like this happens on this page, etc. And, that's, again, I don't think it's a bad thing. I don't think it makes stories predictable, because just because okay, the antagonist is going to do something bad around this time, what they do could be literally anything. And it's kind of comforting though to know like, okay, the antagonist is going to do something bad, and then this is going to happen, and then around the halfway point, something's going to happen to change everything entirely. And then, it's just, I don't know, I find that structure comforting.
One last thing I wanted to mention. Recently, we've been watching Studio Ghibli movies. What do you think about the storytelling in that compared to Western storytelling?
I also find it very like, what in the world is happening, I enjoy the movies because they're super high quality, and they're like, the art is amazing. They're visually amazing. They're just super weird, so it's just like really unusual and novel in that way. But yeah, from a story standpoint, I always feel like there could be 5 minutes left of this movie. There could be like 5 hours left. Like I have no clue like where we are in the story. And like, it certainly like doesn't feel like things get introduced and then not resolved. And then it's like, what was the point of that thing? Like I do have that feeling, like it doesn't ruin it for me, but it certainly is like, leaves me feeling unsettled, like I don't know what's going on here. So yeah, I just, for whatever reason, I'm super attached to the like 3-act structure. It works well for me. And again, I think for a Western audience, it's what they expect and they enjoy as well. All right. So a user on Reddit, Wingman Labs, asked, I don't know if you remember me. We chatted a bit on Discord some time ago. Still very grateful for all the advice you gave me. I do remember this person. I talked to them earlier this year, I think. They were making an adult visual novel using Unreal for the images. So I can't remember the name of it though, but Wingman Labs is the name of the developer. Their question was, as for my question, could you tell us a little bit about how you guys handle the process of writing the story and the dialogue for your games? I'm really curious to hear how other devs approach these steps. So like I said, we have a high level plan that we start with for the whole entire game. We know from a plot standpoint, like the major like motivations, conflicts, the things that are going to happen and how it's generally all going to resolve. And then but at the beginning of each update, we sit down and really pin down like what exact scenes are going to happen and like what's going to happen in those scenes. And then even as I'm sitting down to write the scenes themselves, they often go in another direction than what I planned. But, typically they're not going to go so far off course that they change the entire course of the story. Although we've had a couple of things like that, I think where we're like, wow, wouldn't it be cool if we did this? But then again, I have to usually take a day and sit down and look at my high level plan and figure out where is this going to fit in, right? And make sure that like it fits into the plan so that we're not just like completely making it up as we go along. And then, yeah, once I have all of the scenes for the update, and I typically, like I said, have this ClickUp where I have like a sub page for every scene and I take notes in there. So the notes would be like ideas that you've had, like you're a good idea generator. So typically when we go through and we're like, here's all the scenes that are going to happen in this update, you'll have just like a bunch of random ideas that pop into your head. Like, wouldn't it be cool if this happened in this scene? Or here's what I imagine for this scene, or this image popped into my head. And so you'll write all those down. I typically have notes for myself, like, at this point in the story, like we need to show that the, relationship has progressed emotionally, or like, at this point, the character has reached a point of no return. So we need to show that in some way. So I typically will make notes for myself in a meta sense of like what needs to be shown or happen during the scene, so I can make sure that I don't forget to include that as part of the details in the scene. Yeah, then it's just a matter of like writing the scene and writing the dialogue itself. One of the reasons that I like was interested in writing a visual novel is that my favorite part of novel writing is writing dialogue. And I'm actually part of like a writers group and of friends. And like one of them is a novel writer and she loves to write novels. And one of them was like trying to write novels, but realized that they would like writing screenplays better. And I like related so hard. I was like, that's how I feel too. Because they said, whenever I'm writing a novel, I'm always waiting for the next time that there's dialogue happening. And, I felt the same way. Like it was a pain to write narration in prose, but like I was always happy to write dialogue. It's always very easy for me to imagine like what people would say in a situation. And I could like tell you in words like what they do, but I'm not very good at like making those words sound pretty. But I do think I'm good at writing dialogue, because dialogue is not about like, I've seen criticisms that a lot of AVN developers that they write dialogue that it sounds really stilted and too formal and it doesn't sound like how real people talk. I think that happens. That is definitely something that happens with writers. Some writers are better than others at writing dialogue. However, the reality is that good dialogue also does not sound like how real people talk in real life. Think about any movie or TV show that you've ever watched. People don't talk like that. the thing is like movie dialogue, TV dialogue, visual novel dialogue is like the ideal best version of how people would talk in real life, right? There's no false starts. There's no ums or uhs or whatever, unless you're specifically adding that in to show hesitation. People also tend to be a lot more repetitive in verbal speech because when you're trying to relay information, if it's written down, somebody can read it 5 times and, if they need more time to absorb the information or think about it. And also as you're writing, most people revise what they've written multiple times, right? When you're talking, there's no revision, there's no going back, there's no reading it again. So we tend to say things multiple times in different ways in order to make sure that we're being understood, or also as we refine what our thinking is on a process. When you're writing for a TV show or a visual novel or movie, you don't have to show the characters going through that whole process. They can just say what they mean from the first time because you have the opportunity to think about what they're going to say and revise it multiple times. Again, unless for a specific purpose, you want to show them, their thinking changing over the course of dialogue because of the conversation, because you want to show that growth or whatever. But it's all very intentional, right? The dialogue is always intentional as far as what they say, how much they say, and how perfectly they say it the first time. And, with dialogue, I also think about too, like how a person talks reveals a lot about their character, how many words they say. Like some people are more wordy, so they're going to say the same thing in, 20 words, whereas some people are more concise. They're going to say the exact same idea in 5 words. And some people are going to use more formal and academic vocabulary. Some people are going to use, like what we would consider to be like lower class vocabulary. Some people are going to make grammatical mistakes. I've definitely had developers vent to me that, somebody will reach out to them, and it's often somebody who's not a native English speaker. So they learned English in school. They know the English grammar really well, but they're not like somebody that lives in a country where they're hearing like native English spoken all the time. And they'll be like, oh, there's this grammatical error in what one of your characters says. And it's like, yeah, that's intentional because people don't speak in a grammatically correct way. And written grammar is very different than what is acceptable in spoken grammar. And giving a character incorrect grammar tells you information about them. Maybe they're not super educated, or maybe they're trying to come off as more casual. And yeah, even super educated people like myself, I have a master's degree. I say ungrammatical things all the time because it would be pretentious to say them correctly in spoken speech. There's a certain way that you speak when you're speaking to your friends that is different than how you write. And it's often intentionally like what we would consider wrong. There's definitely things I would say out loud that I would never write in an academic paper, right?
What's one of the things, it was in a podcast, I think this is an example of the pretentious kind of thing. Data?
Yeah, data is plural.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So what's the singular?
Datum.
Yeah, so you don't go around saying, oh, the datum, right?
Right, yeah, this one datum. But I mean, yeah, more educated people will say the data are, or something like that. Whereas, less educated people, I'm not saying that in a derogatory way, but yeah, people that don't like exist in circles where people are using data or data as a plural. Like if you don't live in that world, you're going to use it as a singular. And that says something about you, not positive or negative, but like you are going to come across as pretentious if you're in like a casual conversation with people that don't use data as a plural and then you're suddenly using it. It feels like you're like saying like, I'm saying it right and you're saying it wrong. Like there's all these social implications to dialogue and how people talk that, you have to think about both when you're speaking as a human being, but also when you're writing dialogue.
Yeah. If somebody tried to correct me on that in public, I'd be like, excuse me? I'll throw punch, bitch.
But it's not even correcting, right? Sometimes people perceive it as being corrected if somebody just says it the correct way, right? Even if they don't say like, you're saying it wrong. But it's like, if you're using data as a singular and then somebody walks up and starts using it as a plural, even if they're not pointing it out, like you might feel corrected. And I think that's where the issue comes in.
And then the other point I wanted to make to add on to what you were saying about how some people are more verbose or they use more words or some people have less. We talked about it before. You tend to be very verbose and flowery with your language. Right?
No, this is he's teasing because he's the one that whenever he writes anything, I have to go back in and like edit it down to like 50% because you write like you talk, like you like write it out and you write out every single thought and the whole thought process, but you don't like go back and edit it, so it's like the same thing is in there like 5 times, which is perfectly acceptable for spoken speech. But for writing, it's like, you don't need to say it 5 times because the person can just read it 5 times if they need to. So yeah, I know but I will say too, like, I think you're a pretty like verbose person in speech too.
Yeah.
But I think we both are. It's just that I have a better, like, I have more practice with self-editing when it comes to writing.
Right. Well, also, you have a history of being interested in language in general, right?
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I think I definitely, this is like totally off topic from this, but I do think that's a thing too where being able to choose the right word the first time, that's something that I feel like is easier for me than for you, because you have a huge vocabulary just like me. But yeah, I think you have less practice with having to choose the right word at the right moment,
right. Yeah, my precision is not as good. That's for sure.
But I think that just comes from practice. Like, I think for me, that honestly comes from writing. Like, in graduate school, I had to write like 3 10-page papers a weekend a lot of times. And, the faster that you can come up with the word that you need and the exact sentence that you need, the faster you're going to get through those papers. So you get pretty fast at it.
I had to write really high quality papers for my online college too.
Bachelor's degree was a joke.
It was the best, I promise you. Bigly.
Yeah, we have a lot of arguments about how my college education was extremely rigorous and yours was not. But we have both ended up in the same place, which just goes to show that college is a big joke in both of our opinion. All right. Next question. I don't know how you would pronounce this username either, but another user on Discord said, as a side note, how in the world do you keep track of all your conversations, threads, choices, possibilities as a writer? I get this question all the time, and my answer always disappoints people, which is that I just hold it all in my head. The entire story, like we came up with the story for A Shot in the Dark specifically on a road trip, which is where we do a lot of our talking. And we talked through the major plot points and we made some notes and stuff. And then, I think we just spend so much time talking about it and thinking about it. At least I spend a lot of time thinking about it, that there's just no need to write it all down because it's just constantly on my mind. So it's just kind of always held in there. I do, like I said, I do create like an outline for each update. I have an overall outline for the entire game as far as like kind of the main story goes, not necessarily all the branching. I don't know. This has been a huge thing where there's been many times that I've tried to make like outlines or like graphic organizers or like, whatever they're called, like,
spider webs.
Yeah. Like those visual like webs of like how things fit together. I tried to do that for the first update with like every single little decision, and it took me so much time to make it. And the whole time I was like, I'm just writing down things that I already know, and I would never refer back to this because I already know all of this. And that's been true. We've been working on this game now for over 2 years, and I still don't need to write down I don't have a big like bulletin board somewhere with all the things written down. Like it's just in my mind.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to say to this too, I'm not saying it's a huge factor, but it is a factor. It is nice that we're done with the main story, Prince Suburbia now.
Yeah.
So our minds can solely focus on the story for Shot in the Dark, at least for a while. So even though we're going to be adding more branches and stuff, we're still going to be able to focus on that and hopefully hold on to it and not work as hard about trying to retain that information.
Yeah, shifting back and forth between the two stories definitely was a little bit of complication. I definitely remembered less about the Prince Suburbia story when I would go into like writing an update. Then even though it's totally linear, it was definitely like I would definitely dump it in between updates, and I'd have to go back and read all the previous stuff in order to remember like where are we, what's going on, and then. With both games, though, like I definitely do go back and like look up like what specifically happened here or whatever in terms of like if I want to refer back to something specific. But when it comes to the branching choices of like what branches exist, like I don't know. I just don't have any problem holding that in my brain. Like it's just always been part of the story. It probably helps that we've always had the same high level branches from the very beginning. And then some of the smaller branches that have come about afterward, like they all fit the story and the narrative that we originally designed. And so they're just kind of like intuitive to me. Like, of course it's going to be one of these two options, So I don't know. It's just, there's only been one instance I can think of where we wrote like we were like, already maybe even released an update or we were about to release it, and we realized in one of the scenes that we had not addressed like a very fringe like branch that somebody could have been on, like this is a specific thing that could have happened that we hadn't addressed, although the way that we like kind of just by process of elimination had addressed it was like not inappropriate either, but we didn't specifically address that case. And because I'm one person writing this game, I fully admit there's lots of times in the game where things are purposely vague because I don't want to write like 20 different things for the 20 different paths you could possibly be on, because it just would take too much time and effort. So I think that is part of it too, is that I'm very strategic about, I try to be vague when I can, so that I don't have to worry about addressing a million different paths. And then I kind of save my energy and thought process for the times that I think it'll be really worthwhile to address different paths. Yeah, it's just, I do create like a high level kind of outline like that shows for each update, like the progression of the scenes, like here's the order that the scenes go in, and here's like some of the optional scenes that might happen in between, and like which scenes are going to happen for every player, which scenes are only on certain paths. I do make like a little visual of that in Figma for our testers, so that way they know like if something's going way off, like they can compare to that and be like, I didn't see this scene and I was supposed to, or like, this scene was supposed to come after this scene and it came before. Like, so I do make that to give them a visual, but it's like, I spend time making that, yeah, it doesn't benefit me. It benefits the testers. And this is an area where, we talked last episode about how we've lost so much time trying to bring other people in on the project. And I think this is an area where we lost like a lot of time. And, we learned a big lesson, which is like, we've been working on this story for 2 years. We know the ins and outs, and trying to bring anybody else in, even on things like writing or coding, or if we were trying to bring them in on art, like there's just so much nuance to it that we'd have to explain that we don't have to explain to ourselves or each other. And I just never anticipated how much time we could lose trying to explain that kind of stuff to other people. And yeah, even with the writers, I've gotten, I try to just basically be like, here's like the main bulk of what needs to be written. And then I typically will go in and write like the other paths. And, with the writers that have been on the project longer, that know more of the nuance, I always give them the option. Like, if you want to write the different paths that exist, then please feel free to. But I always anticipate that there's going to be little tiny, like possible paths that they don't know about that I have to write in.
One thing I wanted to pipe in here with is, and I'm not going to name what the game is, but we have definitely seen in the industry that if there's not writing consistency, that the game can suffer greatly and there's backlash. If the characters aren't acting like themselves, if the plot doesn't make any sense, and you don't have that consistency, then it just doesn't have that satisfying feel to the players, and they don't know what's happening anymore, and the game just goes down in quality.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the risks that can come from having outside writers. And, it's an area in which we've talked about many times that having outside writers has not made us any faster. It's still the same amount of time for me to essentially like explain what needs to happen, for them to write it. And then I basically like rewrite it in my own words. Like, I consider it kind of like ghostwriting. I have a friend that's a ghostwriter, and the way that she described it is she's like, like I build the house, but then they like decorate it, with their furniture and set it up the way they want it. And that's how I feel, is like when I ask a writer to write a scene, like they're building a house for me, but then I'm still going to go in and like paint the walls and change the fabrics and like, so it's not going to be their specific words anymore, but because I put it into my own words. But, writing is such a creatively intensive process that having somebody else like build the whole house for you, still saves a lot of energy. And then all you have to come in and do is decorate it. And it allows me to save my own creative energy to like expand on what they've written, as opposed to just come up with the writing from nothing. So in that sense, it's made the writing a better quality, but it costs time for sure. I would say that it's not even necessarily that it's not faster. I would say it's actually slower, because the amount of time it takes me to like edit and like flesh out and like rewrite a scene in my own voice and making sure that the voice of the characters and stuff is all consistent. The amount of time I spend doing that is about the same amount of time that I would spend writing the scene. It's just that the scene is like way better quality than it would be if I wrote it by myself. So yeah, it's a trade-off, but that's, like you said, it's just too important. I need to touch every single word in the game. Like, that's just a given, because otherwise, it would just be too easy for the quality to suffer if I didn't touch every word in the game. And it's definitely not a statement on the quality of our writers. They're not me. Of course they can't write in my voice. Like, that's impossible. So, and I wouldn't want them to waste their effort trying to write like my voice. I want them to spend their effort writing a really good scene, and then I'll put it in my voice. So I know that there's a couple of apps for writing branching dialogue, and some of them integrate specifically with engines like Unity and things. Artisy is one that's been recommended to us a few times, and yeah, it was just like so much setup time to set up something that I already know. Like, I don't need it set up for myself. And since nobody else is going to be doing this but you and me, like, we don't need to set it up for other people. I can see how these apps are really useful when you're working on like a large team where lots of people have to be working on a branching narrative. So it has to be in a format that everybody understands. But if it's just you, or if it's just you and one other person, like, just find, we have a format that works for us as far as me telling you like what happens and what variables to consider and like what parts are like part of a branch and what parts are whatever. We have our own shorthand for that kind of stuff, and we've developed it over years, and like it works for us. And it would, there's no reason to go and like use a pre-made app and spend a million years like setting it up. Like, we already have our method. So if it's just you, like, I feel like you can probably just figure out a method that works for you without having to buy an app. Another one that's popular is Yarn Spinner. I think Night in the Woods was made using Yarn Spinner as far as like tracking the dialogue. But again, that's like a team of multiple people. For just yourself, like, I don't know. I don't know that you really get anything out of that you can't just get from like writing it down on a piece of notebook paper or something, So All right. So Mute Hazelnut, who's one of our writers for A Shot in the Dark and also for Prince Suburbia, she asked what characters are really fun to write for and which ones are the most difficult. And so this question is like a really easy but boring answer, which is that like all of them are fun to write for and none of them are more difficult than any others. At least that's my experience of it. Like I wouldn't write a character that I didn't like or that was difficult to write for, right? Like, so, but in general, just in writing in general, I never find that there's characters I don't like writing for. It's just, I like the process of like getting into somebody's psyche and trying to figure out how they would react to a situation and what they would say and thinking about things through their lens of their experiences as somebody who's like totally different than me. I like that process and it doesn't really matter. There's fun aspects about writing for a character that's like really like brash and just says whatever's on their mind because you're like, oh, well, I could never say this in real life, but since I'm writing for this character, I can say it. But there's really something really fun for writing like for a character that's much more soft spoken and maybe doesn't say everything out loud because you're thinking to yourself like, well, I know what they're thinking, but this is what they're going to say out loud. And it's no matter what, it's a fun process for me. So I like writing for all characters. Typically, whatever character I'm writing at that moment is like, oh, this is the best character. And I'll come to you and be like, man, this character is just so good. They're the best. And then like the next week, I'm like, man, this other character is the best. So same thing goes for art. Whenever I'm working on a particular character's art, because I'm looking at them all day, I'm like, man, they're just the best. They're so cute, whatever. So I don't know. For me, it's a boring answer, but they're all fun. They're all the same level of difficulty. And then Mute Hazelnut also asked, can you describe what makes writing so hard? Because this is something I say a lot, that writing is really hard. It's something that uses a lot of creative energy. And I mean, I've written for a long time, but it was more of a hobby. And like having it be your job, like you just start to quickly realize like you only have a limited amount of creative energy and it's not something that you can generate more of. And if you only have a limited amount, you need to really use it judiciously. And that's where hiring outside writers came into play, was like, you only get so much creative energy for writing. And so, being able to combine that energy with other people, even if it's like not a time saving thing, definitely makes things better. Writing when you're not inspired to write, like when it's your job and you're like, if I don't start writing some scenes for this update, like this update's never coming out, like anything, once you get into it, typically like the inspiration will start flowing, but getting started can be hard. And yeah, sometimes you just get stuck and you're like, I just don't know where to go with this. And I am lucky to have you as a partner that I can come to and like, you already know everything. So I don't have to explain a million things. I can just be like, I'm stuck at this point. What do you think? But yeah, I can only imagine for solo devs how hard that is to not have somebody that they can go to. Because certainly, we bounce a lot of ideas off each other and a lot of ideas come from that.
I don't know if you want to include this, so cut this out if you don't. Do you remember you were telling me that Mute Hazelnut originally asked you, like, don't you enjoy writing?
Yeah, I teased her about this because she reached out to me on Reddit and she was like, I saw it because we had an ad on Reddit that we were hiring writers. And so she was like interested in that. And then she was like, but if you don't mind me asking, like, if you're like, you're an adult game developer. Like, don't you write writing the scenes? Like, essentially, why would you do this if you didn't like it? And it's like, I like it. It's just that, like, when you have 10 love interests in A Shot in the Dark, and then there's like, I don't know, 8 love interests or something stupid like that in Prince Suburbia, and you have to write a scene for every single one every 3 months or whatever. Like, it's just a lot. Like, it's just so much. And it's not that I don't like it. It's just that, again, you only have so much energy that it's just hard to spread it out across so many different, so much writing in the course of a year. There's definitely some authors that write like a book a month and stuff. In that case too, like they're not often writing the same characters and the same story, right? Like there's something about writing for these games. It's like writing for a TV show. Like I think you can get burnt out writing for the same characters, the same kind of general storyline for like a long period of time. You just start to you start to get tired of it. Like you would anything, even no matter how much you like it, you get tired of it. But all that to say that I tease her about that now because, as she's been writing for us for, I think over a year now, she's definitely had times where she's just like, I don't know what to write. I'm just not in the mood, or I have like crap going on in life, which is like what happens to all of us. And she, I've teased her and she's admitted like, yep, I get it now. Like this is really hard. And I remember she even said once, she was like, if I had to make my own adult visual novel, like it would be going at a snail's pace because she's like, it's just really hard to do all these pieces, all the time over and over again, month after month, So yeah, I tease her about that. Hopefully she won't be offended, and one thing too that I've learned about writing long-term as a job is that writing is mostly thinking. There's a podcast that I listened to where they were joking about how like they wrote a book, the team that makes this podcast. And one of them like mostly like thought up the book. And then like, they were teasing though that like the person that did most of the typing wrote most of the book. And they kind of had a little bit of like a joking argument about like which part is more important to the writing process, like the coming up with the ideas or the actual like writing them down. And, as somebody who's done both, it's the coming up with the ideas. It's like the planning everything. I'm an incredibly fast typer. Being a typist is like a specific skill that has nothing to do with your writing ability. And writing is mostly thinking. Another podcast I listened to, she was talking about how her husband is a writer for TV shows and that a lot of his day is spent just taking walks and like doing housework and things. And that she used to, like, I think during COVID when she was home with him and she was seeing this, she was like, you barely work. Like, you're just doing random stuff all day. And he was like, no, I'm writing, like, because writing is mostly in the thinking. And I think that's also why writing for these games is hard, because so much time is spent doing all these other things like art and coding and planning and business stuff and managing people and whatever. And so you just don't have a lot of time to like sit and think, and you don't feel like you have time. Like, even if I wanted to take time, I always feel like there's something else I could be doing. And so it doesn't feel like a good use of my time to just stop and think. But certainly no good writing happens without thinking.
Also, typically speaking, from a programming or coder perspective, that's very much aligned and similar. If you're really trying to implement a new feature or figure out a bug and try to trace your steps or think about what's happening in the functions and in the chain of events that's happening, you very much have to think about things. And it's very highly encouraged, like out in the field, to go take a walk, go take a break, maybe sleep on it, because sometimes you'll come up with ideas that you didn't think of originally when you're trying to focus too hard on your specific problem or feature you're trying to implement.
Yeah, a lot of it, like, you have to both allow space for your subconscious to work, so you're like thinking about other things and letting your subconscious work. And then, yeah, you just need time to let your mind wander, where you're just like, that's why they call them shower thoughts, right? Because it's a time in which you don't really have any other stimulus and your brain can just kind of wander. Or like right before you fall asleep is when a lot of people get ideas. So,
and also, I think you have been talking about how you've been dreaming about something. I think it was art.
I dreamed about GUI.
Yeah, you dreamed about GUI.
Yeah, that means you're thinking about it. Yeah.
Yeah, in the past, when I was at the coding bootcamp, I dreamed about parameters. So parameters and functions. And I was like, what the hell am I doing?
Yeah.
But that just tells you how immersed you are in it when you're thinking
about it. Yeah, your brain is working on it even when you don't realize. So yeah, that's something that I feel like is lacking when you're working on a game where you're working on so many things at once, is that you just don't have the space to really let them simmer. Because it's not just the writing. It is the art. It is the coding. It's every aspect of it. Like, creativity requires like space to think. And when you're super busy, like, you just lose that space. And so, yeah, that's something that you have to be really intentional about. My friend that does the ghostwriting, so, she writes a lot of books every year. And yeah, she's talked about that too, where she's like, I just spend like an hour a day just like walking on the treadmill, like with nothing, like no show on, no nothing, just thinking. Because yeah, you just need that space. Otherwise, like you actually save time in the long run, because otherwise you have to do that thinking while you're trying to write, and that's often less efficient. So yeah, that's why writing is hard. It's a lot of creative energy. It's a lot of thinking, which requires a lot of just open time to think about things, which is always at a premium. When you're not inspired, you can power through it, but it's not going to be as good, or it's going to take longer to get it good, because you're having to start at a much lower quality of idea to work your way up to the better ideas. And then of course, like, writing episodically, like for a visual novel or for a TV show or anything like that, can be kind of constraining too, because you feel this extra added pressure to think about all the things that are coming down the line, because there's not going to be any opportunity to ever come back and change what you're writing now in any like significant way. We've definitely gone back and changed like little tiny details where we're like, it's not a big deal, or like, we didn't really clarify this was confusing, or we said it was like this day of the week when really it was that day of the week. But like, certainly you cannot go back and change major plot points. That's not okay. So, and then of course, as we mentioned in another episode too, you asked about like if writing for the multiple branches is what makes it hard. And, I wouldn't say it makes it hard, but it definitely gets tedious, because, you're writing for multiple branches that are all super similar, or like, as I said in that episode, it's like, there's the fun scene where like everything is, all the content's unlocked and it's all the fun stuff is happening. And then there's like the not as fun version of the scene where like nothing fun happens. And of course that version is not as much fun to write for.
Yeah, I think we've talked about this a few times now too, which is related to all the branching. Like, it's a huge pain in the ass, especially when it comes to writing, especially when it comes to implementing. And then when it boils down to it, I think the payoff is going to come out when we're done with the game.
Yeah.
When we complete it, because it's going to stand the test of time for a while, because it's actually going to have some real choices that matter. Whereas we've talked about it before, we could have made an easier game, could have pumped out content updates faster with very minimal branching. And it could have been successful, but this game, because of the nature of it and the gameplay based being around choices, yeah, like I said, it's going to stand the test of time, hopefully, and people are going to really enjoy it and see the impact that they make throughout the game.
Yeah, it's like we've talked about before too. People like seeing humans reach their full potential, and writing a game with a lot of branching and choices. It's something that's like, it shows a lot of like passion and hard work, and people just like to see that. They like to see something that required a lot of work put into it and a lot of thought put into it. So I agree. It makes something stand up over time better when it has like more complexity in it, because it makes it something that people can come back to and enjoy, and it's going to be slightly different that next time, or it gives people more things to talk about as far as talking about it. One of the things we talk about, I'm in a book club, and we read books, and there's books that we all really liked, but then we had nothing to talk about, and then there's books that we like all kind of generally hated, but we had so much to talk about, so it's not even necessarily like about it being good or bad. It's just like something that's really complex and interesting just gives you a lot to think about, gives you a lot to talk about. And that makes something stand the test of time when it has that extra like spice or flavor to it, for sure. All right. So I think that was all the questions that we received so far about the writing process for adult visual novels. And we hope that our answers were helpful and enlightening.
Thank you for sending in your questions. If there's anything else you're curious about, whether it's about writing, game development, or anything else we do, don't hesitate to reach out. We hope we planted some seeds with you. See you next time.
Bye.